So let's talk about Hideo Kojima today. What you're doing, what you're thinking. First thing I want to ask you is, I think people would be very fascinated just to understand what your typical day is like. We see your Twitter sometimes. How many of you guys follow Mr. Kojima on Twitter? People, right? So we see you twittering about the rain in Los Angeles and the food you're eating. You see what noodles you're having and things like that. But what is your typical day like in your life? I mean, do you get up and go to the gym? I mean, how many hours of sleep do you get? Tell us a bit about what your life is like.
So first of all, just a little disclaimer. My work hours are an exception to the rule. Most of the people at Kojima Productions work a normal day from 9 to 5. But in my case, I have to manage the business aspects of game creation along with producing the game and handling all the creative aspects as well. So it's basically like working 3 jobs. So unfortunately, I am very busy. So one thing is because of the disaster situation in Japan right now, we've actually have a policy of coming into work a little bit early to try and conserve electricity. So usually I wake up at about 5 a.m. and try to get into the office by about 6:30. So during the morning, the first thing I do is I have corporate meetings with Konami Corporate. Then after that, I have the Kojima Productions meetings with the team members. Then after that, I have a meeting with some of the new employees to kind of get to know them and meet with them. And then after that, then I have my own time to start working on my own projects, which I unfortunately can't give too many details about, but that's what I work on during the morning. So then in the afternoon, that's kind of my time to concentrate on work. So while I check my email, approve designs, handle all the expense reports, whatnot, I write scenarios, work on the script, also take a tour of the studio, kind of check on the status of all the various projects. And of course, I'm producing several projects at once, so I kind of go and make sure each one is on track. Then at night, generally, I'll go out to dinner, perhaps meet with some industry people, have dinner with them, brainstorm,
Play some games.
watch some movies, play some games, that kind of thing. So generally speaking, by the time I get home, it's around midnight, pretty late. Then after that, I start doing my Twitter and everything else as well. So I try to finish that up by about 1, take a shower, get to bed by 1, but usually it bleeds on to about 2 in the morning or so. So I get about 4 hours of sleep. I'm trying to get more, but that's generally what it averages. But again, this is just me, so don't, the normal staff works from 9 to 5, so don't be too terrified by that.
Well, that brings up an interesting question. I was talking to someone here before, actually, that they had the lady known as EA spouse here a few weeks ago talking to some of the classes. And, there's a lot of, I think, questions in the industry about work-life balance and how hard people have to work in the gaming business. And you have a family, and, they're important to you as well. Tell me about, how do you feel your balance is between your work and your life and spending time with your wife and children? Is it something where you feel that you have achieved a good balance? And most importantly, do you think your family would agree with you in your assessment?
So actually, that kind of hits on a sore spot for me. Unfortunately, I think, for people who want to create something new or want to do something big, unfortunately, certain things may end up being neglected. So unfortunately, I'm still trying to find that balance. But what I try very hard to do is limit my work to the work week. So during work, I concentrate completely on my job. I do all my work, but then on the weekends, as much as possible, I try to spend all that time with my family. So, but of course, back when I was making Metal Gear Solid 1, it was a small team. I had to go into the office during the weekends oftentimes, but at the same time, I wanted to do something with my son. So sometimes I'd actually bring him into the office. And for MGS1, we actually blocked out stages using Lego blocks. And my son would actually have a great time playing with the Legos. And sometimes he'd actually kind of design some stages that I took some inspiration from. So, and of course, I'm always busy. So, I always told my wife, oh, I'm busy with work and I have to do all this. It's terrible. I'm very busy right now. But what happened is after I brought my son to the office, he went back to my wife and told her, Dad doesn't really work. He's just at the office playing all day with Legos. So, but of course, once my oldest son got a little older and old enough to understand these things, I did have a serious talk with him and, tried to apologize for not being around all the time. But, I was relieved to hear that my son actually said that, rather than having a father who's just kind of sitting around the house all day looking bored, he'd rather have somebody who maybe isn't there all the time, but when he is there, he's very lively, full of energy, and fun to be with. And so, in that sense, I guess you could say I felt very relieved.
Now, let me ask you, another more serious question, and I alluded to it in my introductory remarks about you. what I've always admired is that your games do very well internationally, and they sell well in the United States, they sell well in Europe, and you are a man of the world. You're always traveling around and spending a lot of your time visiting different countries and meeting your fans around the world. Why do you think your games do so well? And then, sort of along with that question, I wanted to ask you about a trend that I think we're seeing increasingly, where the Japanese market is feeling very much at a distance from what the rest of the world wants to play, and I think is struggling in some ways. And some creators have said that it's a sense of crisis about how do we make our games appeal on a global scale, as we look at the big franchises like you joked about, the Call of Duty and things like that. A lot of that's coming from the Western market. So I wanted to ask you sort of your thoughts on that, because you're one of the few designers from Japan that have been very successful around the world.
So I guess first of all, it's often said that there's a bit of a technology gap between the West and Japan, and that's a problem. And while that is a problem, I don't think that's the root of the problem. There's something deeper. So if I can go back to an earlier slide, I showed those 3 games that really influenced me, Super Mario Brothers and whatnot. And back in that era, when Japanese games were very strong, I think games really weren't that specific. They're very abstract at that time. They weren't limited to a certain culture. You were limited in what you could convey, but at the same time, that made them universal. It was something
Your
that
imagination
anybody, right? You filled in the gaps, and it was something that anybody could relate to. It was kind of like the silent era in movies, where Chaplin was famous all around the world. And so now, with the modern era of games, it's possible to convey very culturally specific elements in the games, language being one of them, but also cultural references, various other things, appearance of the characters and whatnot. So in that sense, I think it's really entered the kind of like the talkie era, if you were to compare it to movies. And so I think that's one big reason why we feel that gap right now. So as an example, games that are popular right now in Japan often feature as the main characters high school girls, or really beautiful looking guys, right? And that's great in Japan, it sells well, but there's no way that's ever going to be really accepted in the West. But of course, 25 years ago, you couldn't express those culturally specific elements in a game. So you just had Mario, who looked like this pixelated guy with a mustache, and some turtles, right? And so, again, you can look at the movie industry and see parallels here. Because if you look at the Japanese movie industry, you can see that they very seldom do well overseas, outside of Japan. Even if they're really great movies, they're made very well, and they win all these great awards at film festivals, they don't meet commercial success, usually. In order to do that and appeal to a wider audience, they basically have to be remade for the global audience. One example would be The Ring. It's a Japanese story. It was made in Japan, but it didn't become successful in the West until they remade it as an American story set in America with American actors. And so, in that sense, going back to a previous example, in my case, I'm not so concerned with kind of setting these stories within Japan. And I think it's due to the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, I was exposed to many different cultures when I was young. I watched a lot of different TV series. I watched a lot of movies, read a lot of different types of books. So, for me, making a story based in Tokyo featuring a high school girl as a main character is not necessarily my priority. And I think you'll see that most of my games actually feature a bunch of old men.
Now you're known as a visionary game designer. I think people are always interested in where you think the video game business is going to go. So before I kind of wrap up my questions and we get to some of the questions from the audience, we've seen the Fox engine. Obviously, that's sort of part of your vision of where you want to see the industry go, and I'm sure we'll see Fox engine games in the future. But where do you see gaming going? Not 50 years out, but 5 years from now. I mean, there's lots of talk about what are the next consoles going to be, what is it going to look like. What excites you when you think of Kojima Productions and games 5 years from now?
I don't know, 5 years from now, maybe Call of Duty 10. Of course, maybe my next game might come out by then too. So, up till now, if you mentioned a 5-year span, and it's been customary up till now for game platforms to have generally about a 5-year lifespan. But I think that's kind of going to change from this point on. I think moving on from this point, it's going to be less an issue of hardware, because we're going to see basically computers kind of evolve into this cloud architecture where basically you're surrounded by these digital devices. Things are up in the cloud. There may be augmented reality. So you'll be surrounded by all of these elements. And of course, they'll be used for useful things like exchanging information and whatnot. But of course, entertainment, I think, will be a big part of that equation as well. So I think, it's not just limited to games, but I think it really will change the way that we function as a society. And, it'll affect all these things from the digital realm will start becoming, coming into the augmented reality realm and really change the way that we interact with each other in the world. So, once again, I think once augmented reality becomes mainstream and say, AR glasses or maybe contact lenses, I don't know what it'll be. Once that becomes mainstream, I think it really will have a profound effect on the way we live our lives. So, I'm not sure if this will happen within the next 5 years, maybe not, but I think eventually what will happen is as AR kind of permeates our lives, things such as the exit sign up there, the designs on everyone's t-shirts, all that stuff will enter the AR realm, and it'll really change the way that we interact with the world and each other. And I think, our cities and everything that we interact with will be quite attractive and more beautiful than it is today as a result.
So as we wrap up here, at least my part of this Q&A, I'm wondering, you remember those old days when you started at Konami, your first days on the job, and a lot of people here will be, going out into hopefully working at game companies, maybe like Kojima Productions if you're hiring, right? But what do you think it takes to go from where you remember starting at Konami to where you are today, to have your own studio, as you said, 3 jobs, and not everyone will necessarily aspire to do as much as you have done, but what do you think it takes to go from starting out in the business to being where you are today? What drive does that take?
So first of all, I think a lot of people misunderstand that when they enter a game company or a studio, that you have to change your behavior to conform to their rules. But I think it should be the other way around, really. If you're a creative individual and you enter a company,
Should be a rebel.
you should try to change things in order to achieve your vision. So, I've been with Konami for about 25 years now, and I think I've, succeeded in changing the company in many ways to something that I feel matches my approach to games, much better. And I think everyone has to strive for that. Come up with your own ideas, rebel against the system, try to change things. Don't feel limited by these rules.
Fight the power. Any final words of wisdom for this crowd, Mr. Kojima, before we get to their questions? Any thoughts you want to leave them with?
Okay, well, this is something I often say, but I believe that creating something new is all about making the impossible possible. And so I think, many of the things that we come to think of as being impossible, they're not really impossible. I think about 90% of them actually can become possible. And the only reason people say it's impossible is because no one's ever done it before. But if you're a very creative individual, you can find ways to make it happen. And so I think it really is precisely by achieving the impossible and surprising people and doing something that no one's ever done before. I think that's what really earns your respect and gives you credibility as a creator. And so that's something that I've always believed in, that I always keep very close to my heart. Back in the day, they said man would never walk on the moon. Da Vinci said it was impossible, but we've done it. We've been to the moon. So I think, the things that you want to achieve, whatever you have in your mind, I think there's a good chance it can be done.
All right, we'll leave it there. Hideo Kojima, everybody.